All right, class, I'm recording this at 5 a.m. in the morning, and hopefully it will be up on Schoology before 8 a.m. because I am not the hero you deserve, but I am the hero that you are going to get this semester. So, speaking of heroes, we are going to read about Grendel, our hero's first villain, and and where he sort of comes into the story here. So the thing is, we don't actually meet Beowulf until we get, I think, to like section 2. So we have a little bit of a subtext here, a little bit of history in the story, some backstory, if you will, to set the stage. So Hrothgar, king of the Danes, has built a wonderful mead hall called Herit. And so understand a mead hall is like a beer hall. If you've ever been to Germany, these are very popular. Obviously, you guys are young and you may not have been able to partake of the beverages themselves, but understand these are like it's like a big gathering hall. And it's kind of like a seat of culture and stuff. And I'll get into why that's maybe relevant later, but just understand it's kind of like a beer hall. This is a place where people go and drink in times of peace. And so anyway, and this is also where the king kind of lives. So Hrothgar, king of the Danes, has built a wonderful mead hall called Herit, where his subjects congregate and make merry. As this selection opens, a fierce and powerful monster named Grendel invades the mead hall, bringing death and destruction. Okay. So, we're going to actually get into the poetry of this thing now. So here we go. Now, if you remember, I shared the Old English, and it had this sort of swaying motion. So pay attention to where these commas are and where the periods are. Look at the punctuation of this poetry as I read it, and understand that that is giving me a cue in terms of how I read this and with what rhythm. And if you remember the professor in the video we watched, it had kind of a da 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 da, and I'm going to try to pay attention to the commas and try and preserve that rhythm as much as possible. So here we go. A powerful monster, living down in the darkness, growled in pain, impatient, as day after day the music rang, loud in that hall, the harps rejoicing, call and the poets' clear songs sung, of the ancient beginnings of us all, recalling the Almighty making the earth, shaping these beautiful plains marked off by oceans, then proudly setting the sun and moon to glow across the land and light it. The corners of the earth were made lovely with trees and leaves, made quick with life, with each of the nations who now move on its face, and then, as now, warriors sang of their pleasure. I'm going to pause for a minute, and I'm going to say, you know what? I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit before I move on. I'm going to do that thing that teachers do, right? When they read stuff. So I don't think that you can see oh, cool. I think you probably can see this highlighting. So obviously this first part, powerful monster living down in the darkness, we've already known if we read the subtext, this is all about Grendel. You can tell that by the title. So hint, hint, the monster is Grendel. But this is very interesting because, again, we're talking about warriors here, right? But we don't start out in a time of war. These are not warriors who have necessarily seen battle in a while. Because if we hear, as day after day the music rang loud in that hall, the harps rejoicing, when you think of war, you think of drums, right? You think of armies marching in unison. You don't think of the harp. The harp is an instrument of peacetime. The harp is an instrument of pleasure. So this is very relevant, I think, to sort of set the tone and why is this monster so absolutely devastating to these quote-unquote warriors? So the harps rejoicing call and poets' clear songs sung of the ancient beginnings of us all, recalling the Almighty making the earth, shaping these beautiful plains marked off by oceans. So hang on a second. This sounds like, if any of you guys are or a Christian, or even if you're Jewish or Muslim, they have the same beginning stories, origin stories in the book of Genesis. And this is kind of sounding a lot like that, isn't it? Right? I forget the exact lines. I'm maybe paraphrasing a little bit, but what is it? On the first day, God created the heaven and the earth, and there was a void, and God shone the light upon it. Right? It's something like that, right? And understand that this story about Beowulf, at its core, is a pagan story. This is not a Christian story. And yet here we are getting essentially this Christian origin story embedded into here. Now, why is that? Now, remember, I think I alluded to this in one of my lectures. I hope I did it in both of my classes. This is one of the benefits of recording stuff like this. I can make sure that I get it and don't forget it, because I think it's an important point. I mentioned in one of the classes that when you write somebody else's story down, you have a lot of power. And so what was going on at the time that this was written, understand this was an oral story that was passed down from generation to generation. And what ended up happening was the Christian monks took this story and wrote it down. And when they did it, they kind of made it less pagany. They made it less, they took the story of this indigenous people, of the people who were already living in England when they came and they brought Christianity to it. And when they wrote the story down, they changed it in certain ways to make it connect to Christianity. And so in a way, you could think like, okay, so that's cool because we have these themes that kind of come across cultures, and you could find connections to Christianity. And that's kind of like the kumbaya, cute and fluffy, let's all hold hands way of thinking about it. But the other way to think about it, and you kind of have to really, jump between these multiple modes in life. The other way to think about it is to realize they also kind of are erasing the original identity of this poem when they do that. So very, very relevant. And, if you've studied the history of different continents and cultures as they were colonized by the British, understand that the church played a big role in how successful or unsuccessful those attempts at colonization were. One of the most important things you can do if you're going to bring your culture to another part of the world is to really, like, if you can take over things like the religion and sort of the spiritual mindset of the people, it makes taking over their actual resources a lot easier. And that's what we saw if you study, and hopefully we can get this far. But we will see this. This is the kind of stuff you can see if you read a story like Things Fall Apart, or if you just pay attention in history class, honestly, right? If you think about mercantilism and how the African continent was colonized, and India as well. India was trickier because Hinduism is an interesting polytheism. But anyway, I won't go too far into that. But anyway, so understand two big things from this first page, right? We got three big things, really. There's a monster coming. His name is Grendel. This is a pagan story that was rewritten by Christians, and it's very obvious as you read this that it was rewritten by Christians. But if you're not thinking about that, you may just assume that this was a Christian story, which is what those writers want you to do, right? But that's not the truth. And then three, Hrothgar's warriors are not, they're not perhaps battle ready, because this is kind of a peaceful time. And then we have this ominous image of a tree. Ooh, very shadowy tree. All right, I'm going to take a sip here and then keep going. Here we go. Now, poetic devices to be looking for. Remember, repetition of those H sounds. There were a lot in the beginning, actually. Let me go back for a second. Lines 1 and 2, it wants us to look back at the alliteration. A powerful monster living down in the darkness, growled in pain, impatient. It says to look at the P's and the D's. So we got powerful, pain, powerful, pain. I should highlight these, right? Let me be a better teacher. Down, darkness. Now, there are even stronger examples if we go through this, right? But if you needed to write one example of alliteration on your worksheet, that's one. And I promise if you go through this, you can find more. Another thing you have to look for is kennings, right? So this first phrase, a powerful monster, instead of referring to Grendel by his name, they allude to him by using a metaphor or an explanation. So that is kind of an example of a kenning. There will be stronger ones later. All right, here we go. So Hrothgar's men lived happy in his hall. Looking at this here. So Hrothgar's men lived happy in his hall, till the monster stirred, that demon, that fiend, Grendel, who haunted the moors, the wild marshes, and made his home in a hell, not hell, but earth. He was spawned in that slime. So hang on one second. So again, we have this reminder that Hrothgar's men were living happy prior to all of this. And then the monster stirred, that demon, that fiend, Grendel, who haunted the moors, the wild marshes, and made his home in a hell, not hell, but earth. So a little bit of alliteration there with these H sounds, the repetition of hell. Haunted, hell, hell. So let's find about the origin of Grendel here. He was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, again Christian origin, Christian origin story getting embedded into this. Monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures banished by God, punished forever for the crime of Abel's death. The Almighty drove those demons out, and their exile was bitter. Shut away from men, they split into 1,000 forms of evil, spirits and fiends, goblins, monsters, giants, a brood forever opposing the Lord's will and again defeated. So, very interesting connection here. So, this is actually very, very clever when you think about it. So, what is going on here is, so the pagan mythos is filled with fiends, goblins, monsters, and giants. Okay, if any of you guys have ever played Skyrim or watched Lord of the Rings, right, or Harry Potter, even sort of leans back into this. We have these ideas of like elves and stuff. Where did those creatures come from? Well, they come from the pagan mythos. They come from that Anglo-Saxon origin and the stories that those people told, right? Now, what these writers are doing, these anonymous Christian monks who are rewriting this story, what they have done is they have connected those creatures to Cain. And if you're unfamiliar with the story of Cain, it's a good one to know. It's one of the first stories. It's in Genesis after Adam and Eve. Hopefully, you guys know that one. I don't have to teach that, but hopefully, the story of Adam and Eve after they get kicked out of the garden because Eve eats the apple and whatnot, and they understand shame and sin. They get kicked out of the Garden of Paradise, and they have kids. They have two sons at one point. They have Cain and they have Abel. And so Abel is kind of like, he's kind of like the good one, right? And then Cain's kind of like the not so good one. And what ends up happening is Cain gets so jealous of Abel that he kills his own brother. And this is like another one of those like original sins in the Bible. To kind of like express that like mankind has like this dark side to them, and we can be bitter and we can be jealous and selfish and do horrible sinful things, like we're capable of it. And so again, so this original sin of betrayal and selfishness and jealousy from Cain is attributed to Grendel, but also all of these creatures. All of these mythical creatures that exist in sort of the pagan mindset and mythologies. All right, so now Let's keep going. So again, these evil creatures come from Cain is sort of the idea here. They are descendants of Cain, and they have a lot in common with Cain, which we'll see in a second. Because you have to ask, like, why is Grendel even attacking these people? And it's very arguable. You'll see that it's probably because he's a little bit jealous of what they've got. All right, so let's keep going. So let me try that rhythm. Da 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 da. Then, when the darkness had dropped, Grendel went up to Herit, wondering what the warriors would do in that hall when their drinking was done. He found them sprawled in sleep, suspecting nothing, their dreams undisturbed. The monster's thoughts were as quick as his greed or his claws. He slipped through the door, and there in the silence, snatched up 30 men, smashed them, unknowing in their beds, and ran out with their bodies, the blood dripping behind him, back to his lair, delighted with his night's slaughter. At daybreak, with the sun's first light, they saw how hell he had worked, and in that gray morning broke their long feast with tears and laments for the dead. Hrothgar, their lord, sat joyless in Herit, a mighty prince mourning the fate of his lost friends and companions, knowing by its tracks that some demon had torn his followers apart. He wept, fearing the beginning might not be the end. Stop there for a second. So what is Grendel doing? Grendel is coming specifically when darkness had dropped. This is relevant. He does not come out in the day to terrorize people. He comes out at night, and understand that this is kind of supposed to be representative kind of his cowardice. He doesn't attack in daylight. He attacks at night when people are vulnerable. And understand that the night was incredibly scary to the ancient world. I don't care what part of the world you came from, what part of the world your ancestors come from. Just understand that for ancient people all over the world, nighttime is scary. Always. This is something you see across cultures. And because what happens at night? Well, you can't really see. And you have to sleep. And when you sleep, you're vulnerable. And this is across cultures. And when you really think about it, it makes so much sense because they did not have electricity. They did not have artificial light. They had fire by this point, yes. Excuse me. But understand that, somebody probably had to stay awake and keep watch, and it was hard to get a good, comfortable night's sleep. We live in a time where we are relatively safe in our beds. Relatively, of course, right? But we don't have to worry about wolves coming and just eating us in our beds. And so this is sort of representative of that. But it speaks lengths to Grendel's character that he only attacks in the night. And he's also very gruesome when he attacks, right? The monster's thoughts were as quick as his greed or his claws. He slipped through the door, and there in the silence snatched up 30 men, smashed them, unknowing in their beds, and ran out with their bodies, blood dripping behind him, back to his lair. So Grendel attacks in the night. He attacks hard, right? He kills multiple people at once, 30 at a time. This is a horrible raid. He is devastating. And then he kills people in their sleep. Again, incredibly cowardice. And so this is going back to that Cain and Abel story. He is a monster of betrayal. And so daybreak, this is when they reflect upon the slaughter. Hrothgar, their lord, remember that is the leader in Herit. He sits joyless in Herit, in the mead hall, a mighty prince mourning. So again, a mighty prince mourning, that's an example of a kenning, perhaps, for you, instead of just saying his name again. His lost friends and companions, knowing by its tracks some demon had torn his followers apart, he wept, fearing the beginning might not be the end, right? So this line here, the beginning might not be the end. This is that tension builder. This is that, but wait, there's more, all right? So let's keep going. What more happens? Well, let's find out. And that night, Grendel came again. So this doesn't happen once, guys. This is a repeat thing. This monster Grendel comes in when people are sleeping, kills 30 people at a time, and does it again and again. So let me keep going. And that night, trying to highlight this for you. And that night, Grendel came again, so set. Let me do this rhythm. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So set on murder that no crime could ever be enough, no savage assault quench his lust for evil. Then each warrior tried to escape him, search for rest in different beds, as far from Heorot as they could find, seeing how Grendel hunted when they slept. Distance was safety, the only survivors were those who fled him. Hate had triumphed. Oof. That is a very heavy line there, right? Hate had triumphed. So Grendel is winning, you guys. Like, there is no stopping Grendel. Why don't they just kill him, right? So, well, let's keep reading to find out, right? Because you might ask, well, so they're running, they're trying to find different places to sleep. People are fleeing the kingdom. Now, understand, like, when people move, like, that takes away power from the king, right? He needs his subjects. Like, what is a king without a kingdom? And what is a kingdom without the people living in it, right? So, like, this is bad, you know? Like, you either stay and remain loyal and get killed by Grendel, or you move, right? You know, because the king is not, you know, able to protect them, which we'll get to in a second. Actually, I'm jumping ahead. Spoiler alert, right? So Grendel ruled, fought with the righteous, won against many and won. So Heorot stood empty and stayed deserted for years. 12 winters of grief for Hrothgar, king of the Danes. Whoa, hang on. How long? I can't, 12, 10 and 2, 12 winters, 12 years. This is an entire generation ravaged night after night by this monster Grendel. That's tough, guys. This is, you know, like, Grendel is a monster. So, like, an entire decade plus, Grendel has been destroying and attacking these people, right? 12 winters of grief for Hrothgar, king of the Danes. Again, king of the Danes, a kenning there. Sorrow heaped at his door by hell-forged hands. This phrase, hell-forged hands here. Again, that is an example of both very, very wonderful alliteration with those H sounds, but also a kenning. This is an allusion to, this is meant to make you think about Grendel, right? They don't say Grendel again. They could have said heaped at his door by Grendel, but they don't say that. They say by hell-forged hands, right? So again, we understand that Grendel is like a monster from hell. And so we can just say lines like this poetically that sound better than just repeating the name. And we understand that it is an allusion to Grendel. It is a kenning. All right, here we go. Keep going. His misery leaped the seas, was told and sung in all men's ears, how Grendel's hatred began, how the monster relished his savage war on the Danes, keeping the bloody feud alive, seeking no peace, offering no truce, accepting no settlement, no price in gold or land, and paying the living for one crime only with another. No one waited for reparation from his plundering claws. Plundering, right? So there, not only is he a murderer, he's also a thief, right? So again, he's sort of this embodiment of greed and selfishness and kind of like insecurity. You know, when people who kind of get, I don't want to get too much into this metaphor, but, you know, sometimes people get kind of bullied and they get insecure and then they kind of become awful instead of becoming stronger than the people that bullied them. Grendel's kind of like that manifestation of that flaw in human nature. That shadow of death hunted in the darkness, stalked Hrothgar's warriors, old and young, lying in waiting, hidden in mist, invisibly following them from the edge of the marsh, always there unseen. So mankind's enemy continued his crimes. Again, mankind's enemy, kenning, you could write that down. Killing as often as he could, coming. Oh, so many wonderful C's in these two lines. Continued crimes, killing, could, coming. So many wonderful C sounds there. There's your alliteration. Alone, bloodthirsty and horrible. Though he lived in Heorot, When the night hid him, he never dared to touch King Hrothgar's glorious throne, protected by God. I'm going to stop there because this is an important detail. So why is it that Hrothgar cannot be touched by Grendel? Well, he can't be touched by Grendel because he is a king, and you need to understand that for the Christian writers doing this, they are not writing this in the time of Beowulf. They're writing it sort of like after the fact, and they're doing it in a time when there's sort of this feudal idea that a king is untouchable. A king is blessed by God. Like the reason why you could rationalize and justify having a monarchy at all is because, first of all, you have to believe that there's at least one person who is good enough to be a king, who deserves that role. And how do you rationalize somebody having that much power? Well, you do it by saying that God gave them that role, and they are blessed by God. And so this is that sort of Christian feudal idea coming into play here, getting attached to this. But I've thought about this a lot, and I'll maybe say some of my ideas about Hrothgar in class, but I'm under the impression that he's maybe a bit pampered. He's maybe a bit comfortable. He's not a strong enough king, probably because he hasn't had to actually work enough. He's helpless. He can't actually fight Grendel, right? Because he was a king in peacetime, right? He's not like a warrior king. He's a peacetime king, and he doesn't know how to fight Grendel because he's never had to face a monster like that before. And we don't learn how to face our monsters until, unfortunately, we have to defeat other smaller monsters, right? It's almost like a video game, but this is how real life works. Our monsters these days are not actual wolves, lions, tigers, and bears that come in the night. Our monsters are things like learning how to drive a car. Our monsters are things like, learning how to apply for that job and face rejection. Our monsters are like, trying to find somebody who, will like go out with us and stuff, like these are the sorts of things that we all have to overcome as people and in order to become better and stronger versions of ourselves, right? And King Hrothgar, I think because he is a king, and this is sort of just my take on this, I think that because he is a king, he's kind of helpless in the face of these challenges. But anyway, the writers can't say that even if they thought that, but I feel like I get these hints here about that. But anyway, but the sort of what the Christian writers here are saying is that he can't be hurt because he's protected by God because he's a king. So he sits on his throne. So he being Grendel here, Grendel never dared to touch King Hrothgar's glorious throne, protected by God. God, whose love Grendel could not know. God, whose love Grendel could not know. So Grendel cannot know the love of God. This is, pardon me, it's actually not a particularly Christian idea. This is like kind of saying that, the big difference between like Christianity and a lot of the religions that came before it is like Christianity sort of says like, everybody is capable of achieving salvation, right? Through knowledge and love of Christ, right? That's sort of the idea. But this is saying that like Cain, I made a mistake here, but it was actually a relevant one. It was a connection. I said Cain instead of Grendel. Grendel is like beyond that salvation, according to this here. Like Grendel could not be loved back by God ever, that's a tough thing to say, right? All right, but Hrothgar's heart was bent. The best and most noble of his council debated remedies, sat in secret sessions, talking of terror, and wondering what the bravest of warriors could do. So it's like, what are we going to do to fight this monster? This is maybe more indication that this is not a civilization that is very understanding of war, right? This is a peacetime civilization because, what are we going to do about this monster? We're going to have a council and we're going to talk about it, right? And it's like, that's not what you need to do in this situation. You need somebody who's going to act, probably, right? Like somebody needs to just kill this stupid monster, right? But they're like, well, let's form a committee and let's talk about what our options are before we make a decision, guys. So like just understand, like, this is more hint that, like, these people are not ready to fight a monster on their own. All right. They wondered what the bravest of warriors could do, and sometimes they sacrificed to the old stone gods, made heathen vows, hoping for hell's support. So again, here's this heavy, heavy Christian influence saying, like, shun the non-believers, shun the pagan traditions, and also, acknowledging that these pagan traditions are in this story. So the Christian monks that are writing this and translating it are simultaneously saying that, like, yes, these characters did these things, but these things were bad and they didn't work. That's why they didn't work, right? And connecting the pagan tradition with the devil itself. So they made heathen vows, hoping for hell's support, the devil's guidance in driving their affliction off. That was their way, and the heathen's only hope. Hell always in their hearts, knowing neither God nor his passing as he walks through our world, the Lord of heaven and earth. Their ears could not hear his praise nor know his glory. Let them beware, those who are thrust into danger, clutched at by trouble, yet can carry no solace in their hearts, cannot hope to be better. Hail to those who will rise to God, drop off their dead bodies, and seek our Father's peace. All right, so again, it ends on this very, very, very Christian message that, again, there's this juxtaposition, right? So Cain, I keep saying Cain when I mean to say Grendel, which is kind of what they wanted us to do in a way, right? So Grendel is this creature that could never possibly believe in God, and I am saying that I think probably in the original story, one of the reasons why Hrothgar was unsuccessful is maybe because he wasn't that powerful of a king and his kingdom was not very ready for war. But this idea here is that the reason why Hrothgar can't win is because he was asking for help from the wrong source. The Christian idea here is that he couldn't do it because he was making heathen vows, right? He was hoping for hell's support and the devil's guidance, right? So this is kind of that trick that a colonizing power will do, that Christianity has been able to do. They can kind of come in and they can say that the old ways are heathenistic, right? The old ways of thinking, the old religions are bad and connected to the devil, and the reason why you're suffering is because you're like an inferior people and your ideas are bad, right? And like, because that's what they would do when they tried to colonize India and Africa and the Americas as well. They would kind of come in and they would use the religion as kind of a weapon to demolish the initial culture that was there, not actually paying attention to it or respect to it in a lot of ways, acknowledging that it exists, but trying to just point out and just minimize it. And that, by the way, can be very, very effective. Young people are always looking for something different, and believe it or not, in a lot of those cultures, and we can see this if we read a story like Things Fall Apart, when these new people come to these areas of these different parts of the world, and they bring their religion and they bring their sort of moral superiority, young people are very impressionable and they kind of flock to that, right? And so the old ways kind of get destroyed and demolished. And this story kind of is one of the ways that sort of happened, but we can kind of get glimpses of what the culture was like through it as well. Very complicated. But yeah, so that's the beginning. So we got Grendel the monster, we got Hrothgar the king, in Heorot, the mead hall, that is his kingdom, right? And so Grendel is terrorizing this part of the world and terrorizing Hrothgar's domain. So how are they going to save it? Well, tune in to find out.